thank all of you so very much for bearing with us during this period of transition for the foundation. As many of our supporters know, we used to do tons of trips to mainland China and other places in Asia as part of our work, and due to COVID-19, that is certainly a distinct impossibility at the moment. So we wanted to try to figure out new ways to engage with all of you whom we cannot see in person and visit in person, and that is how this webinar series came about. And this is the fifth in a series of 5 webinars that would essentially track what one of our normal trips to Dunhuang, so a sort of classic itinerary, if you will, which would go to Beijing first and look at Imperial architecture, probably the Forbidden City, maybe some other sites, a day of contemporary art where we visit artist studios, and then move on to Dunhuang for several days, and then the possibility of ending in our topic for today, Xi'an, or as it was known during the Tang and other parts of its history, Chang'an. So this has been a really nice way for us to introduce a new crowd of people and people that have wanted to learn a little bit more about places that we visit and places that we interact with on a pretty regular basis in an in-depth and interesting way. So for today's lecture, which again is the last of our series, we will be focusing on the imperial city of Chang'an, which was the capital of the Tang Dynasty. And it's a really wonderful topic, huge area of scholarly interest. And our lecturer for this evening, Christopher Nugent, is a specialist in the Tang. I'll give his introduction in just a moment, but before I do, just a quick talk about the way that this lecture will be structured. For those of you who have not been with us in the past, this lecture will be broken into 2 parts. Professor Nugent will begin by speaking about the infrastructure of the city of Chang'an. And then after a Q&A period that will be led by my colleague, Julia Grimes, who's the Deputy Director of the Foundation, we'll have a quick 5-minute break, and then we'll reconvene, and Christopher will talk about the culture of the Tang court and also just the people and literature and all of the other various things that made the Tang and also made Chang'an a really special place. As we conclude this lecture series, we will have a new lecture series in the fall. It is likely going to be on spirituality along the Silk Road, and we'll be looking at different religious traditions. We'll get back to you once we have a chance to actually put all that together. We're looking at a few different ways of structuring those lectures so that there's ways for you to be engaged and also, take part in things so that there's not necessarily large breaks in between each of those lectures like we have now, about 2 weeks or so. So I think we'll start on those in hopefully October, but you'll hear more from us closer to that period. Give us a little bit to reconvene and to think about how best to structure things. We're still trying to figure out, again, the best way to reach our audience of people, but we're very happy with the turnout. This is fantastic to have so many of you again with us tonight. And without further ado, I'm just going to introduce Professor Christopher Nugent. Professor Nugent is a professor at Williams College. I have to just say very quickly that Professor Nugent was actually my professor when I was at Williams. He was my first Chinese writing instructor and also taught me about Tang poetry, and I have a huge debt to pay to him for instilling the importance of Chinese into me. And really showing me all the various possibilities that there are within the language, the culture, and modern day China as well, of course. Christopher Nugent studied at Harvard and specialist in Tang literature, but we're very happy to announce that he's shifted his research focus and broadened them a bit to include Dunhuang manuscripts. So he's part of our wider Dunhuang family. I can't thank him enough once again for working with me as a student and also taking part in this lecture series today and giving of his time to impart his knowledge with you. So without further ado, may I present Mr. Christopher Nugent.
Great, thank you so much for that kind introduction, Chris. First of all, I'd like to thank the Dunhuang Foundation for inviting me to speak with you today. They do really great work, and I'm thrilled to do whatever I can to help them out in these strange and difficult days that we're all experiencing. This may also be the appropriate time to briefly embarrass the Dunhuang Foundation's executive director, Chris, by telling stories of when he was just starting his study of Chinese as a student in the first modern Chinese language class that I ever taught about 16 years ago. But fear not, Chris, I'm not actually going to do that. I will merely note how impressed I am by all that you've accomplished since then and the great work that you're doing now. As Chris just said, my own primary area of research is the literary culture of medieval China. The term medieval is, of course, borrowed from the discourse around European history. When we use it for China, it's mostly out of convenience to give a general sense of the time period. And the way that I use the term in the context of Chinese history, it really refers to the period between the broad spread of the use of paper around the 4th century CE to the widespread use of woodblock printing in the early 11th century. Within that period, I focus primarily on the Tang Dynasty from 618 to 907. And most of my recent work, as Chris just said, has been on documents discovered at Dunhuang, in particular, educational documents that were found and were used by mostly lay students at monasteries in Dunhuang. Now, my topic for today, Tang Dynasty Chang'an, is distant geographically from Dunhuang, but closely tied to it in terms of culture and trade. And I do want to note at the outset that I'm not an urban historian. My understanding of Chang'an comes from reading literary works written about it during the Tang and in later periods, and also the excellent work of other scholars. And I want to particularly note Professor Victor Xiong's exhaustively researched book, Sui Tang Chang'an, a study in the urban history of medieval China. Much of the factual information that I'm going to convey in this talk is based on his work. So as Christian said, there'll be two main sections in my talk today. I'm going to speak first about the structure of the city, the way it was laid out in terms of its walls, its streets, and its buildings. The second part of the talk will deal with the people who actually lived there and what they did inside these walls, on the streets, and in the buildings. But I also want to note that I'm not going to structure this talk historically. That is, I'm going to talk about aspects of Chang'an over the course of its 300 or so year history in this period altogether. This was a dynamic city that changed over the course of these 3 centuries, of course. Buildings went up, buildings came down, new markets arose and disappeared, and so forth. But I'm going to talk about them all in a mix, only occasionally discussing specific incidents of or examples of historical change. Chang'an, the location of modern-day Xi'an, was the center of the Tang world in every meaningful way. It was the political center with, for most of the period, the emperor's primary residence and the location of his court. It was the ritual center where he and his court carried out many of the performative and religious aspects of his rulership. This is, of course, not in any way separate from being the political center. Religion, ritual, and politics were always closely entwined. This also meant that it was the administrative center of the Tang state, with the highest concentration of officials who oversaw essentially all aspects of governance. Now, while it was from these aspects, those related to the government, that Chang'an gained its primary importance, this also made it an economic center. Goods flowed to Chang'an from every corner of the Tang realm and beyond. Now, I want to share my screen so we can start to look at some maps of Chang'an. Let's see. All right, I hope this is, you see a map showing up on your screen now. Before we get into the details of all of this, I'd like to talk a little bit about how we know what we know and essentially how we know it. So comprehensive historical narratives often hide the quite tenuous nature of our knowledge. And it's good to be reminded now and then of just how limited our understanding of the past really is. For most of the Tang Dynasty, the capital city of Chang'an was the most populous city in the world. It was a crucial economic and cultural hub for much of East Asia. But though this period of its greatest flourishing lasted some 300 years, it ended over 1,000 years ago. And after the fall of the Tang Dynasty, Chang'an became essentially just another provincial city with a storied past that was just that, in the past. So how do we know about that past? Our main primary sources are written works from the Tang period and soon after, and much more recent archaeological discoveries. In terms of the former, the early written works, it's interesting to note that people were writing about Chang'an as a topic for scholarship as early as the 8th century. In 722, the writer Wei Shu composed a study of Chang'an and the other great Tang metropolis, Luoyang, entitled A New Record of the Two Capitals. In the Song Dynasty that followed the Tang, the scholar Song Minqiu wrote what may be the earliest archaeological account of what remained of the old city of Chang'an in his time. We also have many poems, stories, accounts, and other writings by Tang writers that took place in the city. Well, these don't take the city as an object of scholarly research, they animate it, letting us know about the sights, the smells, the sounds, and the great variety of activities to which Chang'an played host. Archaeological work from the 20th and the 21st centuries provides another type of evidence. But there is a problem here. Some of the most important parts of the Tang city, including the sites of a number of the imperial palaces, are underneath modern Xi'an, and it's essentially impossible to undertake large-scale excavations of the sort that would give definitive evidence of, say, the size of old palace walls and so forth. Now, some other parts of the city, including some palaces, have been excavated, and these finds can give us a sense of the basic structure of many parts of the city. When all of this is taken together, it gives us a pretty good idea of the layout of the city, where the major architectural structures were, what kinds of things people were doing, and where they were doing them. In short, we know a lot more about Tang Dynasty Chang'an than we do about any city that preceded it in China. Now, it was not the first major city in the general vicinity of modern Xi'an, and I would ask you now to take a look at this map. The Qin Dynasty had its capital of Shenyang to the northwest, and the Han Dynasty had its own city of Chang'an, even closer to the Tang city. To the west were the remains of even older cities. And more importantly, Tang Chang'an is really more accurately described as Sui Chang'an when one is talking about its origin. The city, originally named Da Xingcheng Chang'an, or City of Great Ascendancy Chang'an, was commissioned by Emperor Wendi of the Sui Dynasty from 582 to 583. This is when he commissioned the building of the city. And it was in this earlier period that the city's basic structure was set. So what was that structure and why was it used? It's crucial to keep in mind that Chang'an was very much a planned city. This was not a market town that grew organically according to the flow of trade, but rather the careful result of imperial urban design. Scholars have shown that there were two main influences on this planning. The first was canonical texts, and the second is considerations of what's often called geomancy, but it's really better thought of as topomancy. What that means is the reading of the contours of the land to prognosticate the impact, good and bad, that those contours will have on the future. The term in Chinese, which many of you may know, is feng shui, or wind and water. I'm going to move to the next slide here. This is our basic outline of Chang'an. Planning for the city began with divination to find the most auspicious site, that is, the site most likely to bring prosperity and peace in the future. In terms of its most basic structure, the plan focused on symmetry and the division into two parts by a north-south axis that ran from the palace city, which is essentially a city within a city where the emperor lived, up here, in the north, to the suburbs beyond the main city wall in the south. And you can see that axis running down the middle of the city right here. Within that basic structure, various numerological concepts come into play. Many of these come from the canonical work on city planning, the Kaogongji, or the Record of Artificers, which dictated the basic size of a capital city, the number of gates in each wall, and many other aspects, most of which had numerological significance. In some aspects, Chang'an conformed to this text quite closely. In others, it did not. According to the Kaogongji, a capital city should be a square with sides of 9 li, or about 2.3 miles. Chang'an ended up being much bigger. It's about 5.4 miles on its north-south axis by about 6 miles running east-west. It did, however, come much closer to the canonically defined shape than did any previous major Chinese city. This text, the Kaogongji, further dictates that the city should have 3 gates in each wall for a total of 12, connected to each other by straight roads. This was followed by the city planners in terms of numbers. And you can see the gates here. Let me highlight them. These names on the side indicate the city gates. And there are 3 up here. However, the location of the palace city in the northern part of the layout got in the way of the northern gates. And they, as a result, were not symmetrically placed. We'll talk about this more in a minute when we discuss some of the streets. The fact that the palace city is in the northern part of the main city is itself a deviation from the ideal plan in the Kaogongji, which actually says the palace city should be in the southern part. All right, let's look at another map here. Some of the deviations from the Kaogongji were simply for pragmatic reasons, but others had to do with the second major influence on city planning, topomancy or feng shui. Now this, I have to admit, gets somewhat complicated, so I'm going to skip some of the details. But in essence, the 6 major ridges of the city that you can see labeled here, running down this way, were read by the city planners as forming a hexagram, a form of 6 lines, either broken or unbroken, from the classic of change, the I Ching, an immensely important divinatory and philosophical work from the classical tradition. And that reading of the city as a hexagram dictated to some extent what would be put in different sections of the city. from the palace city in the north to the residential areas, markets, and religious buildings. In none of these cases did the plan follow this idea perfectly. And in many cases, the different ideals, the canonical and the topomantic, were actually in conflict. But the planners did their best to try to balance these. This did not, unfortunately, always have great results for the people who actually lived in the city. For example, the first palace city that you see is located right here. We'll talk about some other palaces later on. But this first palace city was in a low-lying area that got very hot and stuffy in the summer, much to the chagrin of its royal occupants. The city was also located farther away from the major Wei River, which complicated the transportation of goods from elsewhere and necessitated the construction of an elaborate system of canals. So let us go back to our main map here. Here again is the result of this complicated planning. The great Tang Dynasty poet Du Fu famously compared Chang'an to a chessboard, and we can see why. Different sized squares notwithstanding, you can very clearly see here the concerns with symmetry and axiality that I mentioned earlier. The sections outside of the main square, up to the north here, were not part of the original plan devised in the Sui dynasty, but were added early in the Tang, and I'll talk about those in a minute. So, some general features of the city. First, we have the outer wall. The city is defined in the most basic sense by its walls. The outer wall, as I noted a moment ago, was about 5.4 by 6 miles, and thus enclosed a space of over 30 square miles. The main outer wall was substantial, but not as large as many city walls would be in later periods. At about 18 feet in height, it would not have been, and indeed it was not, an especially effective defensive barrier. In fact, there were numerous accounts of large animals managing to wander into the city at different times, including many deer, a bear that found its way into a Buddhist monastery within the city, and even a tiger that was said to have made itself at home at the ancestral shrine of a high-ranking official in the year 769. Now, moving in from the outer wall, we find the streets. The basic chessboard layout about which Du Fu and many others after him wrote is formed by Chang'an's 25 major streets, of which there are 14 running east-west and 11 running north-south. Some of these are massive in size, with the largest, the north-south Vermilion Bird Gate Street that bisects the city, right here, about 150 to 155 meters in width. So very, very wide. Some others were nearly as big. And even the narrowest of these major streets was over 30 meters wide. In addition to allowing the city's massive population the necessary space to move about within it, the wide streets also served as a form of fire prevention, a constant concern in Chang'an, as it was in essentially all pre-modern cities. The wide streets with no buildings had essentially no fuel for fires to continue to spread. We can also see here how some of these streets end in the city's 12 gates. And again, if we look up at the northwest quadrant right here, we can see how the emperor's own palace city breaks up the symmetry of the gates. These other gates move, are connected by straight avenues or streets and on the east-west axis. But when we get to the north-south axis, we have some symmetry there, but we can't have major public avenues continue through the palace city, so they're put off to the side. All right. So between these major streets, we find all these squares, or rather rectangles, that form our chessboard. Most of the rectangles that you see here represent what we often refer to as wards. These were the residential areas of the city, self-contained neighborhoods that were separated from each other by walls of about 10 feet in height. The original Sui period plan had 109 of these wards, but in the early part of the Tang, one was split in two, and then another was absorbed by a new palace area, and there were some other changes that took place. And from 714 on, there were 110 wards in the city, making up almost 89% of its total area. These wards ranged in size substantially, from 68 acres for the smallest to 233 acres for the largest. So they were quite large in some cases. The larger ones would be further divided up by 4 major streets that came together in the middle of the ward, sort of forming a cross, with small streets within each of the 4 quarters. The ward structure played a role in both security and fire prevention. Like the streets, the large avenues, the walls, which were made of tamped earth and brick, could stop fire from moving through. But there was also a security aspect here. The gates between wards were locked every night, and special permission was required to move between the wards after lockdown. There were also strictly enforced curfews, and if you were caught outside after a curfew, you would be given a warning twang of a bow by one of the guards, and if you did not heed that warning, the next twang might result in an arrow actually flying into you. So people were very careful to not be out after curfew, or if they were out, to be as stealthy as possible about it. Now, in terms of security, this meant that the populace was tightly controlled. If a crime was committed in the night and word went out, the culprit would find it difficult to flee. At the same time, being stuck in somebody else's ward after the gates closed provided a useful plot device for some of the popular romantic stories that circulated at the time. From the point of view of the individual city dweller, wards defined much of their day-to-day experience. High officials typically lived in those that were close to the center of power, and others had their own identity, as we'll see. You can get a general sense of the different wards from the following map. Get this up here. So we have over here the darker shading. These were primarily the wards in which high officials and wealthy members, wealthy residents of the city lived. They were near the palace city. They were near another palace that we'll talk about in a minute. In the western part of the city, these wards were occupied by commoners. This section down here, interestingly enough, was mostly open land that was still farmed for much of the time. And when we move into this corner in the southeast, we find areas that were primarily scenic areas. And we'll get back to those and talk about them in a minute. If you think back on the map of ridges, and I'll go back to that here, you can see that this same southeast corner also has both higher elevations and steeper inclines. And this is one of the reasons why it was separated out for scenic areas. You could climb atop these ridges and get a view of the city. Go back to our main map here. All right, so after the residential wards, the largest areas of Chang'an are those that are taken up by what we might broadly call the government. At the top of this was, of course, the emperor and his family. In the original plan of the city, they lived in the palace city at the northern end of the city proper. Within this city within a city were the major imperial palaces and other buildings that served a range of purposes, from living quarters for the emperor, the crown prince, and the palace ladies, to offices of various royal institutions and academies. We could easily spend the full hour talking about all of the different buildings the palace city held. But frankly, I think that descriptions of buildings can get pretty tedious. And of course, we don't have that many renditions of them. I would note that the palace city is almost entirely under downtown Xi'an now, and thus most of it has not been excavated. So our knowledge of it comes almost entirely from early written sources, and in some cases, paintings, but we don't have too many of those, and most of them are later copies. The other two major palace areas were the Daming, or Greater Brightness Palace up here, and the Xingqing, or Increasing Felicity Palace down here. The Daming Palace was built in 662 to 663, in part because of royal dissatisfaction with the climate around the original palace city. It then became the main royal residence and was connected to 3 concealed passageways through which the emperor and his entourage could travel to other parts of the city out of view of the populace. Because the Daming Palace did not have as many later structures built over it, archaeologists have been able to undertake more extensive excavations there and have a pretty good sense of its structure. The Xingqing Palace, off to the east, the northeast there, was built in 714 and later expanded. It was the most luxurious of the palaces and was especially favored by Emperor Xuanzong, who had it built and spent much of his time there. He ruled from 712 to 756. After his fall from glory with the Anlushan Rebellion in 755, the palace was used much less, with later rulers usually residing at the Daming Palace instead. South of the original palace city, and about equal to it in size, was the Imperial city, which was the location of the head offices of the major bureaucratic ministries. If the empire was ruled from the palace city, it was administered from the imperial city. It's worth noting that Chang'an was the first capital city in China to put these two areas directly adjacent to each other and both on the central north-south axis of the city. Though Chang'an was a governmental city in essence, it was much more. The original city plan set up 2 massive marketplaces on the eastern and western sides of the city. Here's the western market, and here is the eastern market. These are near the north-south center of the city. These were about 470 acres in size, so double the size of the largest ward, and divided up into many streets and subsections, typically according to trade or the sorts of goods that were being sold. These divisions were referred to as han, which might be thought of almost as the equivalent of a bazaar. While the eastern and western markets were the sites of most commercial activities, there were at least 5 other markets that functioned at different points in the city's history, though none lasted for the full duration of the dynasty, other than the eastern and western markets. And of course, all sorts of business went on outside of these more official areas as well. And we'll look into this in the second half of the talk. One last aspect of the city's structure that I'll note here is the various parks and scenic areas. The largest of these were the Xi'an Park to the north of the original palace city, and the extensive grounds of the Daming Palace, which included streams and a substantial lake. These, alas, were very much out of bounds to anybody but the emperor and his family, entourage, and guests. For ordinary residents, the largest park was the Furong, or Hibiscus Park, in the southeast corner of the city, which held the Serpentine River, a lake that had been dredged out of a river there in the early 8th century. It was a popular place to see various botanical beauties, birds who were visiting on their migration, and to picnic and observe the moon on certain feast days. So that's the basic structure of the city. I focused on larger structural aspects and thus haven't yet talked about monasteries, temples, and the like. But I'll get to those when we talk about religion in the second section of the talk. So now why don't we turn to questions, if anybody has any.
All right, Professor Nugent, thank you so much.
No problem.
We have a few questions that have been coming in as you've been speaking. The first is, what was the specific name of the book on Chang'an that you cited?
Oh, sure. It was Sui Tang Chang'an, a study in medieval urban history. Actually, I think that's the title. Oh, I have it right here. Yes, a study in the urban history of medieval China. Sorry. And the author is Victor Xiong. His surname is spelled Xiong. And it's encyclopedic. I highly recommend it.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Our second question, this getting into the material of the talk, is what type of water system existed?
So there were canals that were dug primarily to bring water for purposes of transportation from some of the rivers that were located up in the northwest into the city. And within the city, there was a system of canals that were again used primarily for transportation. In addition to that, there were wells that were dug throughout the city for drinking water. There were also ditches on the sides of the major roads that were used primarily for drainage. They were not ditches, as you see in some medieval towns in Europe, that were used for refuge. In fact, refuse and night soil, as it's called, was all collected and brought to fields for fertilizer. But the canals were very important for transporting especially heavy things like rice that was coming up from the south.
Oh, fascinating. Okay, so it was a primary means of importing things to the city that did not grow there naturally.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. I have a question. What is your favorite ward and why?
My favorite ward. I've never thought about what my favorite ward is. I mean, the ones that I read about the most are the ones that are, that are up here in the northeast section of the city. The reason for that is twofold. One, this is the area where a lot of the high officials lived. They're also the people whose literary collections and literary works have survived. So they're the ones we know the best. A number of them lived in the Ani ward here, the Chang'an ward, the Chang'an ward. Another reason this area is better known is it's the location of the entertainment quarters. And I'll talk about that more near the end of the talk. But this particular ward here, the Pingkang ward, is the location of the entertainment quarters. So we have a lot of kind of gossipy accounts of what went on there, a lot of poems written to courtesans. And so those are areas that we know fairly well from accounts. So those are the ones that I guess I think of the most, basically.
Okay, a great answer. We have a question. Are there rivers which surrounded the entire city as a form of protection?
There were not protective moats. There were some moats that were dug. They're really more ditches, but they didn't have the same kind of full protective purpose that you see in medieval and early Renaissance cities in Europe. I don't know as much about this topic. In fact, I know very little about this topic, but by and large, even in Chang'an, which had relatively small walls compared to some later Chinese cities, the walls were really thick compared to cities in Europe and the Middle East. So they were the main, the main protective source there. Chang'an wasn't a castle. It wasn't a small city with a castle in the middle that could withstand a siege of months or something like that. It was
Right.
really meant to be protected more by an army rather than its physical defenses.
Okay, so it had a great deal of protection surrounding it, like the country, itself, the empire itself was protecting it rather than a lone fortress out in the middle of.
That's exactly right.
Okay. Someone would like to thank you for your talk and asks,
my pleasure.
she asks, could you say something about the people who were moved into Chang'an after the city was founded? I reckon there were not that many people who lived in the area prior to that.
Yeah, so this was a center of what we would now call Chinese civilization. So there were, in fact, lots of people in the area. Now, it's a complicated question because you have large-scale migrations between the end of the Han Dynasty in the 3rd century CE and the founding of the Sui and then the Tang in the 6th and 7th centuries CE. But this was always a major population center. So even though the city itself is built essentially in the Sui, there were always lots and lots of people there. So you would have a combination of people that already lived there. And I should note that that's a fairly diverse group in this period. You had what we would now call Han Chinese. You also had people from Central Asia. You had Turkic people who had been living in the area for centuries. I mean, the Tang family itself, some of its background is from Central Asian Turkish groups. So there were already a lot of people there. Now, when it becomes the capital city, of course, it also attracts lots and lots of other people because there's money to be made, there's a government to be run, there are entertainments to be had, and so forth. So I don't know of people being intentionally moved into the city, except as laborers. Certainly, I mean, to build a city of this size requires a phenomenal amount of labor. And that labor, what we often call corvée labor, no doubt came from all over the empire. All male citizens who were not monks or were not scholar officials were required to give some service in the form of corvée labor. And one of the things they would do is build cities and build palaces.
Okay, fascinating. Thank you. Our next question is, do we know anything about education in the city?
Oh, we know a tremendous amount about education, actually. Yeah, there's, and I'll talk a little bit about this in the second half, but Chang'an is the location of what we might call almost the National University. It's a educational institution that's within the Imperial city here that is intended to educate men who are going to take the civil service exams. So there's a pretty substantial population of students connected to that kind of national level of education in the city at any given time. 7,000 who are there to take the exams, to prepare for the exams, and so forth. Now, beyond that kind of national level of education, there are lots and lots of smaller contexts in which students are getting educated. Some of this is taking place in people's individual homes. There's clan education. There are all kinds of things. So Chang'an really is the center of education for the empire. And this is where people will really be trained to serve as scholar officials. Now, of course, there's education going on all over in other places as well. And the texts that I work on from Dunhuang are really strong evidence for that. You have monastic schools and other schools in the farthest reaches of the empire. But I think one could argue that the center is really in Chang'an.
In Chang'an. Okay, thank you. We have another question, and I think this will be, maybe we'll have one or two more before we break. What do the names of the wards refer to?
So they all have meaning. They range from names that are used because they are auspicious. The same way you might give a child an auspicious names, the wards themselves have auspicious names. And they don't refer to the activities that are actually going on there. So they don't convey the, they don't convey the character of the ward. So when we say that, for instance, the King Kong ward here, so something like kind of peaceful health or something like that, it's not given that name because it's the entertainment quarters. So the names are more connected to everything from divination to simply picking names that are melodious and auspicious.
Auspicious. Okay. All right, thank you. So one more question before we break. Compared to imperial cities from other dynastic periods, what are some standout features of Chang'an?
I guess I would say the strongest feature is how carefully planned it is and how carefully laid out. So though the basic structure here with a almost perfect symmetry and axiality was an ideal from very early on, it was rarely followed to the extent that it was in Chang'an. And the planning for Chang'an was not only influential for later Chinese capital cities, but also for cities like Kyoto and cities in Japan and Korea as well. But rarely, if ever, was the ideal realized to the extent that it was in Chang'an. I guess one other thing I would say is it didn't really have wonderful strategic value. So this is kind of a negative. It was fairly far from the Wei River, farther than earlier capitals had been. And it was difficult to get goods from the south there, which became a problem in later periods. And in fact, that's probably one of the main reasons why Chang'an did not persevere as a major city, even though it wasn't the capital anymore.
Oh, that's great. Oh,
I guess one other thing I would mention, sorry, that stands out is in the Song Dynasty, you don't have the same kind of ward system. So a result of that is that you have a far more robust evening entertainment culture, I would say, in later periods, because the ward walls, for all their use for security and fire prevention, also keep a lively nighttime culture from developing.
Ah, so it separates and isolates people.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Oh, it's fascinating. Well, I'd like to thank you so much. The first part of our lecture is done. Right now, we have a time of 6:50 p.m. Central Time, 7:50 Eastern. So if we can break for 5 minutes and come back at 6:55 Central, 7:55 Eastern, I'll look forward to seeing everyone then.
Now that we know the basic layout of the city, let's turn to the people who lived and visited it. First of all, how many people were there living in Chang'an? The number that gets thrown around the most is about 1 million. As it turns out, this seems to be pretty accurate for most of the Tang period. We know that the capital population was over 825,000 according to a census conducted in 742. But this indicates only the population that is registered for tax purposes. It does not include, for example, the full royal family, which could get quite large, the palace entourage, soldiers, monks, nuns, foreigners, and transients, that is, those avoiding registration for tax purposes. When all of these are added, most scholars agree that we get to about the 1 million mark, and about half of those lived within the city walls proper. Now, this number could fluctuate substantially. The population took a massive hit during the years of the Anlushan Rebellion from 755 to 763. The emperor himself, of course, fled the city. It probably lost about half of its residents at that point. Now, it seems that it largely recovered in the decades that followed, but it was diminished at other points later on, especially during the occupation by the rebel Huangchao in 881 to 883. In any case, for most of the 3 centuries in question, which is, of course, longer than the existence of the United States, it's good to keep in mind, Chang'an was the largest city in the world and drew people to it from as far away as India and Japan. To another slide here. One of the results of this great influx of foreign influences was the large number of religious establishments in Chang'an. The most prominent religions in Chang'an during the Tang were Buddhism, which had been in China for many centuries at that point, and Taoism. To vastly oversimplify, the latter, Taoism, was based on indigenous Chinese beliefs and practices that had become more codified and institutionalized, in part in response to and under the influence of successful Buddhist institutions. While Buddhism enjoyed substantially more popular support, the Tang royal family traced its own lineage back to the legendary founder of Taoism, Lao Tzu, and thus promoted Taoism to a greater or lesser extent in different periods and depending on the individual ruler. The original plan for Chang'an included 2 large institutions, one Buddhist and one Taoist, on either side of the main Vermilion Bird Gate Street, in a place that was thought to have, again, based on topomantic considerations, a particularly strong royal aura about it. We can see that's right around here on the map. The monasteries were placed in these areas to counteract that royal aura so that no challengers to the throne would arise there. You want the royal aura only in the north where the emperor himself is. You don't want people from other royal aura rich parts of the city to suddenly spring up and challenge him. And these were the Xi'an Monastery and the Xuandu Abbey. These 2 institutions, however, represent only a tiny fraction of the religious institutions that were eventually to be found in Chang'an. One recent study has identified 156 Buddhist monasteries and nunneries in various residential wards of the city. And you can get a sense of that by looking at this map and seeing how these religious institutions of various sorts were essentially spread out in almost all of the major residential areas of the city. One of the most important of these monasteries was the Xi'an Monastery, or the Monastery of Great Compassion and Grace, in the southeast quadrant of the city. This included one of the few buildings from Tang period Chang'an that survives in part to present-day Xi'an, namely the Great Goose Pagoda, the Daiyan Ta. It was originally built in 652 to house various Buddhist sutras, statues, and relics that were brought back from Central Asian India by the great Buddhist pilgrim Xuanzang. The pagoda was not only a storehouse, but also a translation center, where many of the works carried back by Xuanzang were translated into Chinese. The Xi'an Monastery was also not a cloistered religious center cut off from the world. Instead, it was essentially open to the public, many of whom would make the climb to the top of the Great Goose Pagoda, which was originally about 170 feet high, or over 12 modern stories. And they would go up there to take in the view of the city and the surrounding countryside. And it's a view that's still spectacular today, although it's a bit more clouded by smog than it would have been in the 8th century. Many would also come to view the monastery's murals, painted by some of the most famous artists of the day. The grounds of the monastery included extensive gardens with beautiful trees and flowers, especially peonies, and stages for theatrical performances. A tradition even developed for successful exam candidates to inscribe their names on the pagoda in celebration of passing the exam. Special boards were actually hung up in the monastery for them to write poems on. And sometimes these boards would be collected and the poems would be transcribed and put into poetry collections. While Taoist institutions were fewer, substantial imperial support meant that they enjoyed success as well, with 48 being built in the city over the course of the Tang. Now, many of you know, I'm sure, that a much wider range of religions were practiced in China during the Tang period than just Buddhism and Taoism, as the texts from many different traditions and in many different languages that were found in Dunhuang well attest. We get a sense of this from what we know about Chang'an as well. The other traditions that had some foothold in the city include Zoroastrianism, Manichaeism, and Nestorian Christianity. Zoroastrianism, which had existed in some form for well over 1,000 years by the time of the Tang, enjoyed some limited popularity in Chang'an among Persians and Central Asians in the city. There appear to have been 6 Zoroastrian institutions in Chang'an, 2 of which were Persian monasteries, and 4 of which were smaller shrine halls that mostly served Central Asian followers of a separate branch of the Zoroastrian faith that was popular in Central Asia. Manichaeism, which in China included elements of Buddhism, Christianity, and Zoroastrianism, was becoming increasingly popular in the early decades of the 8th century in China. Though we don't know the location of specific institutions, we know that they existed in Chang'an. Now, Manichaeism was banned for native Chinese in 732, and thus restricted to foreigners. After many Uyghurs began converting to the faith after the Anushan Rebellion, it was increasingly associated with that specific ethnic group, which may have actually been part of its downfall. It was wiped out completely in Chang'an in 643, just a few years before some major Buddhist persecutions that happened as well. The texts and the artifacts were publicly incinerated. Now, some scholars think this was likely in part as revenge against the Uyghurs for their actions during the Anushan Rebellion, but it seems that there are likely other factors involved as well. Finally, scholars have identified one Nestorian Christian monastery in the city, but it seems clear that there were more, and we simply don't know their specific locations. We also don't know much about the actual activities of city residents at these institutions, and they surely vary greatly depending on the religion in question. But there's no doubt that they were an important part of the urban fabric of Chang'an. Let's now turn from gods to goods, from creeds to commerce, the marketplaces. We know that the 2 main ones, and I'll go back to this on the map, the Eastern and Western markets. There's the Western market over here and the Eastern market over here. We know that they were similarly sized, but they were quite different in other ways. The Eastern market was what we might call more official and upscale. It was close to the Xingqing Palace and surrounded by the wards in which lived some of the richest and most powerful people in the city, from high ministers to generals. The Western market was somewhat less upscale and perhaps more interesting as a result. It had far more foreign merchants with their exotic goods, unregistered merchants, and ordinary people. And as I noted earlier, the markets were further divided up into separate hangs or bazaars, specializing in different goods and services. The Eastern market is believed by most scholars to have had over 200 of these, with each having an average of 40 shops. Some of the specific bazaars that we know about from written sources include butchers, iron sellers, sellers of writing brushes, overcoats, saddles, silk, medicine, and wheat. There were also fortune tellers, ale shops, restaurants, hotels, fruit shops, jade and jewelry shops, bookshops, musical instrument shops, money lenders, and even primitive banking services where merchants could store large amounts of cash. And this is really just a sample. It's pretty clear that one could buy just about anything in Chang'an, including many things from far away. And goods did not only come to Chang'an, they went out from Chang'an to other places as well. Woodblock printing, which was invented in China most likely sometime in the 7th century, was becoming a larger commercial enterprise by the 9th century. We know this in part because of the finds at Dunhuang. A calendar, a medical manual, and a small poetry collection, for example. The calendar is itself a printed document with the name of an Eastern Market Chang'an printer on it. It seems clearly to have come as an object from Chang'an. The other two documents, the poetry collection and the medical manual, are actually hand-copied manuscripts, but they include the names of the Chang'an printers who produced the original printed editions from which these manuscripts were copied. So they also have a connection. This is in Dunhuang. They have a connection to Chang'an. Now, the print industry would increase massively in the succeeding Song Dynasty, but we can see its beginnings in Tang Chang'an. The main markets, the Eastern and Western market, were regulated by administrators who were officially part of the central government. Regulations were very thorough and ranged from standardized weights and measures to price controls for certain goods to quality control. Artisans, for example, had to put their names on the goods they sold and would be punished for selling shoddy products. Market administrators also performed many of the functions that we would associate with law enforcement, such as preventing extortion, preventing pickpocketing, and preventing the causing of chaos by falsely claiming there were wild animals approaching, which was apparently a thing that people did at the time to start sort of a small-scale riot of people running away. The markets were on a carefully regulated schedule as well. They opened at noon, with drums being struck 300 times, and closed about 2 hours before dusk, with another 300 bangs on various gongs. Not surprisingly, commerce in Chang'an extended well beyond the walls and the hours of the markets. Though there were fewer official sources that describe them, it's clear that various businesses flourished in many of the city's residential areas as well. Most of these were connected to food and drink and varied from small stands selling snacks and pastries to inns and ale shops providing both food and drink for nearby residents and lodgings for travelers. There were also shops specializing in tea, which was just beginning to become popular in China. And some of the most famous and infamous commercial transactions in Tang Dynasty Chang'an were of a different sort. For the last section of this talk, I want to turn to the entertainment quarters. It's there that so many important aspects of Chang'an come together, from the commercial to the literary, from the bureaucratic to the romantic. In certain ways, we know a lot about the entertainment quarters, and I spoke about this briefly in answer to one of the questions earlier. The men who frequented them included some of the best-known writers of the age, and there are plenty of poems and other writings that make reference to their experiences there. At the same time, we actually have very few sources that tell us much about the lives of the women who provided the entertainment, and we have almost nothing that's in their own voice. Our most significant source for the topic is a short miscellany written near the end of the dynasty by a minor figure named Sun Qi. His work, which was entitled Account of the Northern Wards, focuses on the Pingkang ward that I pointed out earlier, right here, between the Imperial city and the Eastern Market. The term Northern Ward itself was a general term meaning something along the lines of a red light district. Now, the Pingkang ward was home to various government-sanctioned brothels and similar establishments that provided men of the capital with entertainment, musical, literary, gustatorial, and sexual. In many cases, all of these at the same event. And the location, of course, is no accident. With the center of the imperial bureaucracy, while the center of the imperial bureaucracy might not seem to be the sexiest place in town, the imperial city, as I mentioned earlier when I was talking about education, also housed the Directorate of Education's School for the Sons of the State, and it was the location of the annual civil service exam, both of which attracted young men of means and ambition from all over the realm. And I should note that there were other wards that had brothels in them as well, most in the same basic area, and also that the brothels only occupied a small part of the Pingkang ward. Other sections of that same ward were home to a number of Buddhist temples and residence of various important officials. The women who worked at the brothels typically found themselves there as a result of some great misfortune, being sold by impoverished parents, kidnapped or abandoned by their husbands or families. They received instruction in music, in poetry, in dance, and other forms of entertainment. Indeed, some of them were highly literate, at least in the composition of poetry and song. At the same time, they had essentially no freedom. Their lives were completely controlled by the madams, typically older prostitutes themselves, who ran the brothels, and by the men who paid for their services. There are stories of women who could escape the brothels by being purchased by wealthy men to be their concubines, or even by saving enough money themselves to buy their own freedom. But the reality seems to be that these were infrequent occurrences. Indeed, the reality of nearly all aspects of such a life were likely harsh and cruel. Like the goods in the Eastern market directly adjacent to the Pingkang ward, these women had no agency of their own and were for sale to the highest bidder. The representations that have come down to us in literary writings, however, often do their best to conceal this reality. Commerce is figured as romance. Intimacy that was bought and sold is portrayed as love. What we often find is the literati elite using these courtesans as a way to think about themselves. And it's in this context that we see the close ties between the exam culture of the Tang and the entertainment quarters. While the exam system in the Tang did not yet have the full importance or size it would have in later periods, it was an increasingly prestigious way for men to enter government service. Also, all exams in the Tang were held in the capital. There were no provincial exams in the way there were in earlier periods, meaning that all the candidates would come there each year. And it was a long process. The actual exam itself was only part of it. Candidates, usually around 5,000 to 7,000 at a given time, as I mentioned earlier, would spend many months in the city beforehand, establishing connections with important exam officials and with each other, and participating in the life of the capital. They circulated their writings in hopes of getting the attention of men who had the power and influence to make or break their governmental careers. In other words, they were constantly judged and evaluated by other people who had more power than they did as part of a search for a patron. So beyond the obvious carnal appeal, activities in the entertainment quarters gave these young men a similar lens to think about themselves. The scholar Paul Rouser has written insightfully of this as follows. And I'm going to quote some of his writing here. He writes, "The courtesans provide a unified cultural group that validates and approves of literati behavior while still remaining outside of the literati class. Courtesans gain power to judge literati behavior through their own constitution as a cultural elite. Like the literati, they are carefully educated from an early age. Like the literati, they compete among themselves for status as the most talented or the best poet. And like the literati, they assert that what makes them worthy of respect are their own personal talents." Professor Rouser goes on to argue that only in the entertainment quarters, or perhaps only in literary representations of the entertainment quarters, Are these connections and reversals with prostitutes as peers and judges of the literati possible? At the same time, the social reality always lies just below the surface, dutifully ignored, but impossible to completely forget. I'd like to read part of an entry from the account of the Northern Wards that nicely brings together some of these issues. Now, keep in mind as I'm reading this that when the text reads family or relatives, it means other courtesans at the brothel. And the mother of the woman in question is actually the madam of the brothel. Read this text here. It's entitled Escort Yen. Escort Yen, who lived in the southern lane, had an amorous disposition. She was also refined in taste and a capable writer of compositions and poetry. Whenever she met exam candidates, she would ask them most politely to compose poems or songs as a remembrance. As a result, her chests were filled with colored notes. She later became gravely ill. On one fine day in late spring, she ordered an attendant to help her sit down in front of her porch. She sighed as she looked at the fallen flower petals before her and then called for a brush, writing, "Though a few of her petals remain, a withered flower gasps out her dying breath. I raise a wine cup in fond farewell. Never again in this life shall we be reunited." She instructed an errand boy as follows: "Take this poem and proceed to the wards of proclaimed light and kindred benevolence. When you get there, if you happen to see gentlemen and recommended persons, that is, exam candidates, please present them with my poem and say, 'Lady Yen, despite her illness, will serve you in the lanes.'" She then asked her family to prepare fruit and wine. Several guests arrived and played music and drank until nightfall. Escort Yen said in tears, "Soon I am going to die. I hope that you gentlemen will commemorate my passing with eulogies." Her relatives at first were overjoyed because they thought she had arranged the banquet to ask her guests to defray funeral expenses. But they became extremely disgusted upon hearing these, her parting words. She died, and on the day she was to be buried, her family received several letters. Her mother opened them and discovered that they were all eulogies written in memory of her daughter. She angrily threw the letters into the street, saying, "These won't help me survive for even a day or night." One of Escort Yen's neighbors was Hunchback Leo, a clever singer and a skilled player of the barbarian flute. It was rumored by some people that he had had illicit relations with Escort Yen. The hunchback retrieved several of the eulogies and placed them on her coffin. His voice was mournfully sad as he led the singing. The escort was interred that same day beyond the Green Gate. Scholarly vagabonds who arrived by chance on the scene asked the hunchback to sing the songs which he had composed to the eulogies. He had committed 4 of them to memory. These poems became well known in Chang'an and were frequently sung by mourners at funeral services. That's a good part of the story. There are a few other parts that I didn't read. We see here many themes that are common to such stories. The literary skills of a courtesan, the exchange of poetry between courtesans and scholars, the pledges of love between them. And we also see the cold financial considerations underlying it all. The courtesan is, of course, a prostitute who must serve her customers to her dying day. Upon her death, her mother is disgusted to find that she has missed out on a final opportunity to profit from her daughter. Poetry is nice, but it doesn't pay the bills. But it is in poetry, circulated through the city on paper and voice, that news spreads of Yen's passing and that she is immortalized in literary memory. The entertainment quarters embody so many of the contradictions of Chang'an. They were a government-sanctioned locus of dissolution, where men who spent their days memorizing the foundational text of Confucian morality spent their nights in drunken revelry, putting their literary talents to use, adorning the bedchambers, and in one famous case, the thigh of courtesans with their verses. Commerce, education, wealth, destitution, romance, and coercion all come together in a heady mix that has been a font of inspiration for poets and playwrights ever since. The entertainment quarters were the embodiment of ephemerality. But the great Chang'an itself would decline with the times as well. For 300 years, it was the home of the royal family and the center of government. It was the center of religious activities for people of diverse faiths and backgrounds. It was a center of commerce where everything from rare jewels to other human beings could be bought and sold. It was the center of the most technologically and economically advanced civilization of its time. But it was not an eternal city. The last decades of the Tang saw tremendous bloodshed and destruction, much of it carried out in the streets of Chang'an. Waves of soldiers, whether rebels or government troops, lay waste to the city, plundering its riches and slaughtering its inhabitants. By the last decade of the 9th century, most of the palaces had been burned and large parts of the city lay in ruin. That was the end of Chang'an as it had been. Without convenient access to the increasingly rich and powerful southern regions, it would never regain the status it once had. But like perhaps no other city in Chinese history, it lives on as a place of memory, as the capital of a golden age at the center of its world. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take some questions.
Professor Nugent, thank you so much. That was so illuminating
really
to learn
pleasure.
about the cultural life of the city, the courtesan quarters, the markets, the temples, religious life. I learned a lot, and I'm sure everybody else did too. We have some questions.
Sure.
I'd like to start with 2 housekeeping questions. The first is, can Professor Nugent share the information of the secondary source about religious institutions in Chang'an that he mentioned in the talk?
Sure. I don't have it right in front of me, but I can, actually, the easiest way to find out a lot of the information about the numbers of specific institutions is Professor Xiong's book. He goes through all of the major buildings and temples, and he actually has an index where he gives them all by name. So he has a section on religious institutions there, and that's probably the fullest source in English to use.
Excellent, thank you. And in a related vein, could he please provide the information on the article regarding courtesan culture and scholars that he cited in the talk?
Sure. It's by Professor Paul Rausser.
Rausser, okay.
Okay, yeah. No, I'm happy. That's from part of his book. It's entitled Articulated Ladies.
Oh, beautiful.
And the name again is Paul Rausser, R-O-U-Z-E-R. And it's a wonderful book. And he has a whole chapter there on the entertainment quarters and the way that competition played out there, the way that that literati saw themselves through a sort of almost using courtesans as a metaphor, and many other insights that I'm not doing justice to here. I strongly recommend it. So, Articulated Ladies.
Articulated Ladies. Thank you so much. Okay, so turning from our housekeeping questions onto questions about the talk itself. Where is Xi'an, the pear garden?
The pear garden, I believe, is up in the, I believe it's in the, embarrassingly enough, I don't remember if it's in the Daming Palace or if it's in one of the other palaces, but it's part of one of the Imperial complexes.
Okay, so it's part of the Imperial complex.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now I'm not sure if it's in, I think it's in Daming. I don't think it's in Xingqing. I think it's in the Daming Palace.
Okay, near the Dunhuang Palace. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Our second question is, did the significance of Chang'an as the Western Han capital play a role in the selection of the city as the Sui capital? I.e., was the Sui emperor conscious of this history through imperial texts or archaeological ruins and/or the restoration of Chinese rule after centuries of foreign occupation?
So the answer is yes, yes, and yes.
Okay,
Very,
yes to
very
all.
aware of the history of the Han as, you know, the last major period of rule to unite the realm. Very aware of Han Chang'an as the major capital city. In fact, the north, the question brought up archaeological ruins, and
Yeah.
the far northwest section of the Sui city would have encompassed buildings that were still standing from the Han, mostly as ruins. But so that precedent was very important.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. We have a question about the maps that you've been showing us in your slides. How were these maps drawn? Are they based on official documents or on the archaeological sites that have been discovered?
So the particular maps that I've shown vary. So the one like with the ridge lines, I believe that's modern archaeological work. All of these maps are really a combination of historical sources. There are maps of Chang'an that we have that go back to the Song. We have all kinds of descriptions of the city as well that go into this. And a lot of the things that we find in earlier written sources have been confirmed or in many cases slightly altered by modern archaeological discoveries. So this map, which obviously is somewhat schematized. So most of the streets, for example, look like they're about the same size here. They're not really the same size. You would have the Zhucha Jia, the Vermilion Bird Gate Street in the middle would be much bigger.
Right.
But these are all based on a combination of literary sources, historical sources, and modern archaeology.
Okay, excellent. Oh, I had another question from the same person. Was the city ruined badly during the An Lushan rebellion?
Yes.
Okay.
The city was essentially sacked. Large parts of it were burned. Again, about half the populace disappeared. People fled. Huge numbers of people were killed.
Right.
Palaces were set on fire. So it was a truly devastating event on a scale that I think is difficult to comprehend from a modern perspective. So yes, but of course it survived, and it does seem that within 3 or 4 decades afterwards, the population was going up quite steadily, and probably got back to somewhere around where it was. And the city was truly destroyed by the waves of rebellions and troops coming in at the end of the dynasty.
Oh, okay. So this was like a temporary setback, but then there was a much larger setback with the fall of the Tang.
Yeah, I probably would go beyond setback, but yeah.
I'm being diplomatic.
Yeah.
Minor setbacks when the dynasty falls.
Yeah.
Oh, do we know how large the foreign population was in Chang'an during the Tang?
We might, but I don't.
Okay.
So I think we can only have an estimate because a lot of those people would not be on the tax rolls. So, for example, the census information that I gave earlier does not include foreigners. And I know that there has been work done on how many foreigners there were in Chang'an, but I don't know those numbers. And also it brings up questions of what counts as a foreigner. So
Right.
there, are you talking about some sort of quasi nation state boundaries, or are you talking about ethnic designations? If somebody is from the Tang Empire, but they're not ethnically Han, how do you categorize them?
Right.
So there are a lot of complicated factors there, but I unfortunately am not familiar enough with that work to speak to it. Sorry.
Oh, no problem. That's a great answer. Related to that, we have a question. Was there an Islamic ward in Chang'an during the Tang Dynasty? And if so, what was its name?
Yeah, I don't believe that there is a full regular ward. As far as I know, there were, however, Muslims in Chang'an, and I think that's very clear. What we don't have, and the reason I didn't talk about that and was talking about the city, is I believe we don't have any solid evidence of where the mosques were, but,
okay.
But there were mosques in the city.
So we know they existed, but maybe
Yeah.
not their exact position.
Yeah.
Okay. Someone would like to compliment you. Thank you for the inspiring talk.
Oh,
How,
my pleasure.
what do you think about the differences in representing Chang'an among various literary genres? So narratives, poems, miscellanies, etc.
That's a great question. Some of those differences simply reflect the differences in the genres themselves. So if you think about narrative accounts from the period, they'll be much more focused on gossip, on unusual occurrences, so anomalies, so stories of ghosts, stories of people who can fly, stories of people who have magic powers, stories of were-foxes, foxes who turn into women. There are a lot of those in particular that are set in Chang'an. So those type of things would not be the subject of poetry by and large. So poems about the city, so you have poems that take place in the city. So you have poems about the entertainment quarters, which might give you some idea about what the discourse around the entertainment quarters and around courtesans were, but they wouldn't really be about the city. They would be about certain aspects of the city. You also have poems written by the great poet Du Fu, where he's away from the city and thinking back on it and imagining the city that was and the differences between the city that was and the city. So the city in his mind, the city in his memory, and the city as it now exists, and thinking about that disjunction between his memory and the present reality and the kind of pathos that results from that. So those are the kinds of things that you would deal with in poetry. You also have what are sometimes called unofficial histories that deal with goings on in the city that could involve everybody from the emperor to exam candidates. And they're almost a sort of, they vary as well, but they can almost be a sort of behind the scenes look at the kinds of things that are happening but are not written about in the official histories. They might deal with politics, but they might also deal with scandal in a way that wouldn't be dealt with in the official histories. They augment those official histories, and as time goes by, some of the material from those unofficial histories will work its way into the official histories. So the differences really are generic differences. You have, and you also have poems that are more historical, especially poems about the Anushan Rebellion. There are a lot of very, very famous poems about the fall of the city, about the flight of the emperor and his consort and her family from the city and her eventual execution. You have poems about other aspects of the rebellion that deal with the city. So yeah, so there's a really, really wide range. I say the poems aren't as gossipy. That's not entirely true, in that these miscellanies, these unofficial histories, the romantic tales, they all include a tremendous amount of poetry in them as well. So that generic difference falls apart a little bit, and some of those poems might be much more gossipy.
Oh, that's fascinating. Just like the different tones that were adopted to speak about the city, like among all of these various types of literature. So we're drawing to a close. I have one final question. There are a few questions we're not going to get to, and I apologize in advance to those people. If you have a question that we were unable to cover, please respond to your registration confirmation email. We will receive it and we will be able to forward it to Professor Nugent for you. So if you're one of the people we don't get to, please keep that in mind. Our final question for this evening is, could you talk about the politics of the city? For example, did the imperial household manage the city, or was there a separate bureaucracy that ran the city? Was there an appointed hetman for each ward? How were the leaders of the sections of the city chosen? And did there exist something like guilds that organized the political authority of the citizens?
That's quite a last question.
Yeah, it was.
So I'll try to remember all of these. So in answer to the first question, did the emperor himself administer the city? The answer is no. That there were independent bureaucratic offices that were in charge of management of the city, but those get quite complicated. So I mentioned earlier that the markets, for example, were under the administration of the central bureaucracy. They were not part of the city administration. But even within the city, there were layers of bureaucracy that dealt with different parts of the city, different parts of the fuller capital region, and different aspects of life in the city. Now, I am very much not a political historian, and so a lot of those details I simply don't know. I will say, if you want a lot of detail about that, I recommend, again, very highly Professor Xiong's book. He goes into that in a lot of detail. In answer to the question about the wards, yes, there were headmen for each ward who would have responsibility for what was going on in the wards. There was another, a question about the guilds.
The guilds. So
this has been a controversial topic in the scholarship. These Hangs, the H-A-N-G, what I was translating or referring to as bazaars, there's been a lot of discussion back and forth about whether these were the equivalent of European guilds. And I think the consensus, I don't know if that's right to call it consensus, but there's a strong argument that they functioned quite differently, that they did not have the same kind of independent political power that you had in regulatory power that you had in guilds in medieval Europe. So there were similarities in terms of organization by trade, but they functioned quite differently in political and economic terms. How the people were actually picked to be the leaders of the wards. So there was a full system of democratic representation. I'm kidding. No. There was not. And the reality is I simply don't know. Presumably it was the way other appointments were made within the bureaucracy, a combination of patronage, connection, competency, and position within bureaucratic hierarchies. But that's just a general guess. I really don't know, unfortunately. Sorry.
No, that's an excellent answer. Thank you so much. Professor
My
Nugent,
pleasure.
I want to thank you, like, from beginning to end, for this incredible deep dive, this fascinating exploration into the culture, the history, the politics, the religion, and the commerce of Chang'an. We really can't thank you enough.
Oh, thank you. I really enjoyed giving the talk, and I very much enjoyed getting ready for it. It let me look back at some things that I hadn't looked at for a while, and I enjoyed it.
That's wonderful to hear.
Also, I just want to again thank the Dunhuang Foundation for not just this, but for all of the great work you're doing. It's really important, and I know it's a strange time, but I'm quite confident that you will emerge on the other end of it to continue everything you have been doing. So thanks again.
Oh, thank you. We feel similarly about you with all of your teaching duties and everything in this most bizarre of years. So I'd like to take this opportunity also to thank all of our audience at this time for bearing with us, as Chris mentioned, and adapting with us to this new way of lecturing and presenting and sharing knowledge. It has been quite a sea change this year, but we cannot thank you enough for all your warm, very warm words of encouragement and support. They have meant the world to us, so thank you. As Chris mentioned as well, we look forward to welcoming you back later this fall. We're going to have another series on religions of the Silk Road. It should be equally engaging, and we very much look forward to seeing you then. Until then, I'd like to thank Professor Nugent again, thank all of our audience, and wish everyone a very good evening. Good night.